Hey, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into two really different worlds, two completely different ways of thinking about how we heal. Each one has its own unique map for understanding our struggles and hopefully finding a way through them.
I mean, it's a question we all face at some point, right? When life gets tough, when you're dealing with anxiety or grief or just conflict, where do you even start looking for answers? Well, it turns out the path you choose really depends on the map you trust to guide you.
And in this explainer, we're going to look at two of those maps. On one side, you've got a theological map. It sees our core problems as spiritual. On the other, a psychological map, which looks at our struggles through the lens of relationships and mental patterns. You can almost think of them as two different operating systems for being human, each with its own path to feeling whole again.
Okay, so let's jump into the first one, the path of faith. This is often called biblical counseling, and its core idea is that our struggles, they aren't just random. They're not even primarily psychological. They're actually signposts pointing to something much, much deeper. So from this point of view, something like anxiety isn't actually the root problem. It's more like a check engine light. The real issue, according to this map, is a kind of disconnection, a broken relationship with God. So the goal here isn't just to feel better or manage symptoms, it's to completely reorient your life away from yourself and toward God. So how does that change actually work? Well, this model lays out a really practical two-part process based on the biblical book of Ephesians, and it's a very active approach. The idea is you have to intentionally put off old, destructive habits, and at the same time, you're putting on new, constructive ones. It's not about just sitting around waiting for your feelings to change. It's a structured, disciplined way to renew your mind. And this is where it gets super practical. You're looking at what's called a victory over sin worksheet. It takes that kind of abstract idea of putting on and putting off and turns it into a concrete game plan. See, you start by nailing down the specific problem. Then you figure out what you need to put off, those destructive habits. Next, what do you put on in their place? And finally, you build a step-by-step plan for how you're going to respond differently next time. It's a very clear, structured path to change. Okay, now let's completely switch gears. We're going to throw out that map and pick up a totally different one as we enter the world of psychology. This approach paints a completely different picture. It uses different language, works from different assumptions, and, you guessed it, uses very different methods to help people heal.
In this world, problems aren't seen as sin. They're seen as deeply ingrained patterns, usually learned from our earliest relationships. A really key idea here is the cyclical maladaptive pattern, or CMP. Think of it like this. Say a person is terrified of being abandoned. Because of that fear, they might constantly seek reassurance from their partner. But that constant need for reassurance can actually push the partner away, which, you see where this is going, ends up confirming their original fear. The symptom, the anxiety, is just one part of a vicious cycle.
So a common type of therapy, called interpersonal therapy, is really practical about this. Just look at its four main focus areas: grief, disputes, big life changes, and things like social isolation. What do they all have in common? They're all about our relationships with other people. So instead of focusing on a spiritual state, this kind of therapy zeroes in on specific, real-world problems in a person's social life to help them get better. So you see, it really boils down to this fundamental disagreement about the source of the problem. One map tells you the problem starts in a heart that's broken off from its creator. The other map says the problem is in a mind that's been shaped by its history, by trauma, and by learned patterns. And whichever diagnosis you accept, well, that's going to completely change your path to healing. So this brings up the big question, right? Are these two maps just totally incompatible? Is it an either-or? Or is there maybe a way to build a bridge between these two worlds? Well, in the last few decades, a couple of major movements have popped up within the faith community to try and do just that. The first idea is called integration. And the thinking here is, hey, all truth is God's truth, right? It doesn't matter where you find it. So really valuable insights from psychology are seen as what's called common grace, basically good gifts from God that are available to everyone, not just Christians. The goal then is to blend the best of psychology with Christian theology to create an even richer way to care for people. But then there's another camp, often called Christian psychology. And this movement argues that instead of borrowing from secular models, the church should actually look to its own incredibly deep historical traditions for the cure of souls.
The idea is that for centuries, the church had its own profound psychology, and the real task is to retrieve it and adapt it for today. Okay, to make this whole debate feel a little less abstract, let's take it to one of the toughest human experiences there is: trauma. How do these different approaches help people who've been through profound, undeserved suffering? This is where the maps are really, really put to the test. This is where the rubber meets the road. And this quote from Christian psychologist Dr. Diane Longberg, man, it just perfectly captures a huge shift in thinking. It reframes trauma, moving away from the idea that all suffering is somehow a result of an individual's own sin. Instead, it presents the reality of trauma as a deep, profound call to show up for people with compassion. And when you look at the path to healing from trauma, as described in this compassionate framework, it's just so deeply human. It really requires three things. First, talking, because the story has to be told, maybe over and over to break its power. Second, tears, because you have to express that grief to honor what was lost. And third, time, because this process just cannot be rushed. You know, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if your map is theological or psychological. A truly healing response has to do the opposite of what the trauma did. Trauma silences you, so healing gives you a voice. Trauma violates your safety, so healing creates it. Trauma strips you of power and dignity, so a healing relationship is all about restoring them. So here we are, two very different maps, both offering a path to feeling whole again. One charts a course back to God, the other navigates our complex web of relationships. And maybe, just maybe, the map we choose to follow says less about our specific problem and more about what we believe the whole journey of life is really all about.